dust swirled through the main street of Redemption Gulch, a perpetual haze clinging to the wooden buildings like a guilty secret. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the dry earth and reflecting harshly off the tin roofs. Redemption Gulch wasn't much to look at, a collection of ramshackle structures clinging precariously to the edge of the desert. But it was home to a hardy bunch, folks who had come west seeking a new life, a fresh start, or maybe just a place to disappear. At the heart of Redemption Gulch, both geographically and spiritually, stood the church. A simple, whitewashed building. It was the tallest structure in town, its steeple reaching towards the heavens like a hopeful prayer. And at the heart of the church was Father Elijah, a man as weathered and worn as the landscape itself. Father Elijah was a pillar of the community. He preached fire and brimstone sermons on Sundays, visited the sick and needy, and offered guidance to anyone who sought it. He was a stern man, but fair, and the townspeople respected him, even if they sometimes found him a little distant. He had a way of looking right through you, as if he were judging your very soul. But beneath the surface of piety and respectability, a darkness festered. Whispers circulated, rumors of questionable land deals, and hushed conversations about the sources of the church's unexpectedly large donations. These whispers were quickly silenced, of course. Who would dare question the man of God? Still, a seed of doubt had been planted in the minds of a few. Redemption Gulch was a town built on secrets, on hidden pasts, and unspoken desires. It was a place where anything could happen, where the line between good and evil blurred in the relentless sun. And Father Elijah, the town's moral compass, was about to find his own secrets exposed, threatening to shatter the fragile peace of Redemption Gulch forever. The stagecoach rattled into Redemption Gulch, a cloud of dust announcing its arrival like a herald's trumpet. The horses, lathered and exhausted, were quickly unhitched, replaced by fresh ones eager for the next leg of their journey. Passengers, weary from days of travel, stretched their stiff limbs and squinted in the harsh sunlight. But it wasn't the usual mix of weary travelers that drew the townsfolk's attention this time. As the dust settled, a figure emerged from the stagecoach, shrouded in mystery. A woman, completely veiled from head to toe, stepped carefully onto the dusty street. The heavy fabric concealed her features, her age, even the color of her hair. Only her small, gloved hands were visible. A collective hush fell over Redemption Gulch. Such a sight was rare. Women traveled through town all the time, but never so concealed. Curiosity, that ever-present companion in a small town, sparked and spread like wildfire. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Who is she? Where did she come from? What's she hiding? Father Elijah, who had been overseeing the arrival of the stagecoach as he always did, approached the veiled woman with a solemn expression. He offered her his arm, and she took it with a delicate, almost hesitant touch. Together, they walked towards the church residence, a small house adjacent to the church itself. The townsfolk watched in stunned silence as the pair disappeared inside. The door closed firmly behind them, shutting out the prying eyes of Redemption Gulch. The rumors and speculation intensified. Was she a grieving widow, a runaway bride, or something far more scandalous? Little Jimmy, the baker's son, piped up, "Maybe she's a princess." His mother hushed him, but the seed of fantasy had been planted. The arrival of the veiled woman had injected a dose of intrigue and excitement into the otherwise monotonous lives of the people of Redemption Gulch. They could hardly wait to find out who she was and what secret she held. But little did they know, the woman's arrival would soon expose secrets far darker than they could ever imagine, secrets that would shake the very foundations of their town and their faith. That night, under the cloak of a starless sky, a small group gathered behind the church. The only light came from a few flickering lanterns, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with the secrets they held. The air was thick with anticipation, a hushed reverence mixed with nervous excitement. A wedding was about to take place. Not a grand celebration, mind you, like the ones where the whole town turned out, sharing food and stories and dancing until dawn. This was a secret ceremony, a clandestine affair conducted under the cover of darkness. Only a handful of witnesses were present. Old Man Hemlock, the town's gravedigger, Mrs. Abernathy, the church organist, and Thomas, the stable boy who had been bribed with a silver dollar to keep his mouth shut. Father Elijah stood before them, his face illuminated by the lantern light, his expression unreadable. Beside him stood the veiled woman, still shrouded in mystery. She was slightly trembling. The veil made it impossible to read her emotions. The ceremony was brief and rushed. Father Elijah spoke the words quickly, his voice low and solemn. The veiled woman answered with a soft, barely audible "I do." The rings, simple bands of silver, were exchanged. And just like that, they were married. As soon as the ceremony was over, Father Elijah dismissed the witnesses, urging them to keep what they had seen a secret. He led his new bride back to the church residence, leaving the small group to disperse into the night, their minds buzzing with unanswered questions. Why the secrecy? Why the rush? And most importantly, who was this woman that Father Elijah had chosen to marry in such a strange and hurried manner? The next morning, the townsfolk noticed a new name on the church registry, Sarah Elijah. The whispers started anew, louder and more insistent than before. The mystery of the veiled woman had deepened, replaced by the even greater mystery of Sarah, the priest's new bride. Redemption Gulch buzzed with speculation. The secrets were multiplying, and it was only a matter of time before they began to unravel. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah remained a ghost in the church residence. She was rarely seen outside, and when she was always accompanied by Father Elijah, his presence a constant shield against prying eyes. The veil was gone, but Sarah still seemed to carry a veil of her own, a quiet sadness that clung to her like the dust of Redemption Gulch. She would occasionally appear at Sunday services, sitting quietly in the back pew, her face pale and drawn. She never sang the hymns, never spoke to anyone, never even seemed to make eye contact. She was a shadow, a silent observer in her own life. Some of the women in town, particularly those who had always admired Father Elijah, tried to reach out to her. They brought her baskets of food, offered to help with chores, and invited her to join their sewing circles. But Sarah always politely declined, her voice soft and distant. "Thank you," she would say, "but my husband prefers that I stay home." The townsfolk noticed that Father Elijah seemed to grow more stern and withdrawn after the wedding. He preached with even greater fervor, his sermons filled with warnings against temptation and sin. He seemed to be trying to convince himself, as much as the congregation, of his own righteousness. Maggie, the owner of the Golden Nugget Saloon, was one of the few who wasn't fooled. Maggie had a good heart hidden beneath a tough exterior. She'd seen enough of life to recognize a woman in distress. She watched Sarah closely, noticing the subtle signs of unhappiness, the way she flinched when Father Elijah touched her, the faraway look in her eyes, the constant nervous fidgeting. Maggie suspected that something was terribly wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew that Sarah was trapped, a bird in a gilded cage. And Maggie, who had always been a champion of the underdog, decided that she was going to find out what was going on behind the closed doors of the church residence. She felt in her heart that Sarah needed help, and Maggie was just the woman to give it. The saloon owner was not known to back down from a fight, especially when someone needed help. Maggie's investigation started subtly. She began by simply being more observant. She watched Father Elijah's comings and goings, noticing the times he left the church residence and where he went. She paid attention to his interactions with Sarah, noting the lack of affection and the controlling way he spoke to her. She also started asking questions, casually at first. She'd chat with Mrs. Abernathy after church, subtly steering the conversation towards Sarah. "She seems like a sweet girl," Maggie would say, "but a little lost, perhaps." Mrs. Abernathy, flattered by Maggie's attention, would readily offer her observations. "She's very quiet," she'd confide, "and Father Elijah keeps a close watch on her. He doesn't let her out of his sight." Maggie also befriended Thomas, the stable boy, the one who had witnessed the secret wedding. She'd slip him an extra coin or two when he brought her horses around, and slowly, she began to pry information from him. He revealed the details of the rushed ceremony, the hushed voices, and the overall sense of secrecy. As Maggie pieced together the information, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Father Elijah was not the saintly figure he presented himself to be. He was controlling, secretive, and possibly even dangerous. One afternoon, Maggie saw Sarah leaving the general store, struggling to carry a heavy bag of groceries. Father Elijah was nowhere in sight. Maggie seized the opportunity. "Here, let me help you with that, dear," Maggie said, taking the bag from Sarah. Sarah looked surprised but grateful. "Oh, thank you," she said softly. "That's very kind of you." Maggie walked beside Sarah towards the church residence, her mind racing. This was her chance to get closer to Sarah, to try and understand what was really going on. She knew she had to tread carefully, but she was determined to break through Sarah's wall of silence. "You know," Maggie said casually, "this town could be a bit lonely for a newcomer. If you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to come by the Golden Nugget. I always have a pot of coffee brewing and a friendly ear to listen." Sarah looked at Maggie, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Thank you," she whispered again. I might just do that." A few days later, under the pretense of needing a new bonnet, Sarah ventured into the Golden Nugget. The saloon was mostly empty in the afternoon, save for a couple of cowboys nursing their drinks at the bar. Maggie, wiping down the counter, looked up and smiled warmly. "Sarah, come on in, honey. I've got that coffee brewing, just like I promised." Sarah hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously towards the door, then stepped inside. Maggie led her to a quiet table in the corner, away from the prying eyes of the bar. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the gentle clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversation from the bar. Maggie poured Sarah a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the air. "So," Maggie said gently, "how are you settling in?" Sarah took a sip of coffee, her hand trembling slightly. It's been difficult," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Difficult how?" Maggie pressed, her eyes filled with concern. Sarah hesitated again, her gaze darting around the room. Then, with a deep breath, she began to speak, the words tumbling out in a rush of pent-up emotion. She told Maggie everything. About her family, struggling to survive in a drought-stricken town. About Father Elijah's offer, a large sum of money in exchange for her hand in marriage. She hadn't wanted to go, but her family was desperate. They needed the money to survive. Father Elijah had promised her a better life, a life of comfort and security. But the reality was far different. She was a prisoner in her own home, isolated and alone. Father Elijah was cold and distant, more like a jailer than a husband. He controlled every aspect of her life, from what she wore to who she spoke to. "He bought me, Maggie," Sarah sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "He bought me like I was a piece of property." Maggie listened patiently, her heart aching for Sarah. She had suspected something was wrong, but she hadn't imagined the truth was so heartbreaking. She reached across the table and took Sarah's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "You're not property, Sarah," Maggie said fiercely. "You're a human being, and you deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. And I promise you, I'm going to help you get out of this." The saloon owner knew she had a fight on her hands, but she was ready to do whatever it took to help this poor woman. Maggie knew that simply helping Sarah escape wasn't enough. Father Elijah couldn't be allowed to continue preying on vulnerable families. She needed to expose his sins, to show the town of Redemption Gulch the true face of the man they had blindly trusted for so long. She started digging deeper, using her connections and her knowledge of the town to uncover Father Elijah's past. She discreetly questioned travelers passing through, asking about his reputation in other towns. She spent hours poring over old land records and church documents, searching for any inconsistencies or irregularities. What she found was shocking. It turned out that Sarah wasn't the first woman Father Elijah had helped in this way. There were whispers of other young women from other struggling towns who had mysteriously disappeared after receiving assistance from the church. Some had supposedly gone off to boarding schools, others to work as maids in wealthy families. But Maggie suspected a far darker truth. She also discovered that Father Elijah had been misusing church funds for years, diverting money meant for the poor and needy into his own personal accounts. He had acquired a considerable amount of land and property, all under the guise of church business. The more Maggie uncovered, the more disgusted she became. Father Elijah was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a charlatan who had used his position of power and trust to exploit and manipulate the innocent. She found letters, carefully hidden away in old trunks, detailing his correspondence with families in desperate situations. The letters revealed his manipulative tactics, his promises of a better life, and the thinly veiled threats that ensured their compliance. One letter, in particular, sent chills down Maggie's spine. It was from a young woman named Eliza, who had written to Father Elijah, pleading for help. The letter was filled with despair and fear, hinting at a dark secret that she was desperate to escape. The letter ended abruptly with a scribbled note: "I trust in God, and in you, Father Elijah." Eliza had vanished shortly after sending that letter. Maggie knew, with a sickening certainty, that Father Elijah was responsible. She now had more than enough evidence to expose him, but she needed to find a way to present it to the town in a way that they couldn't ignore. She needed to shake them out of their blind faith and make them see the truth. And she knew just how to do it. Maggie tacked up a notice on the door of the Golden Nugget and on the church bulletin board. It simply read, "Town meeting, noon tomorrow. Important matters to be discussed." No name, no explanation. Just a cryptic message that piqued the curiosity of everyone in Redemption Gulch. The next day, the town square was packed. People from all walks of life had gathered, their faces etched with anticipation and apprehension. Farmers, shopkeepers, cowboys, housewives, they all wanted to know what this meeting was about. Even Father Elijah was there, standing tall and stern, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Sarah was nowhere to be seen. Maggie stood on a makeshift platform, a wooden crate borrowed from the general store. She looked out at the crowd, her expression serious and determined. She held a stack of papers in her hand, the evidence she had painstakingly gathered over the past few weeks. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice strong and clear, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "I know you're all wondering why I called this meeting. Well, I'm here to tell you that there are things happening in this town that we can no longer ignore. Things that are wrong." A hush fell over the crowd. They sensed that something big was about to happen. "For too long," Maggie continued, "we have blindly trusted a man who has betrayed our faith, our community, and our values. A man who has used his position of power to exploit and manipulate the innocent." Father Elijah shifted uncomfortably, his face turning red. "What is the meaning of this, Maggie?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger. "These are outrageous accusations." "Are they, Father?" Maggie replied, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Or are they the truth that you've been trying so hard to hide?" She paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm here today to expose the sins of Father Elijah," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction, "and to show you all the man he truly is." The crowd gasped. The tension in the air was palpable. Redemption Gulch was about to explode. At that moment, a figure emerged from the crowd. It was Sarah. She walked slowly towards the platform, her head held high, her eyes filled with a newfound strength. She stood beside Maggie, her presence adding even more weight to the accusations. "I'm here to tell you the truth about Father Elijah," Sarah said, her voice trembling at first, but gaining confidence with each word. "He may seem like a good man, a holy man, but he's not. He's a liar and a manipulator." She recounted her story, her voice echoing through the square. She told them about her family's desperation, about Father Elijah's offer, about the secret wedding, and about her life as a prisoner in his home. As she spoke, the crowd listened in stunned silence. Some were weeping, others were shaking their heads in disbelief. Father Elijah stood frozen, his face a mask of anger and fear. "He bought me," Sarah said, her voice filled with pain. He paid my family for my hand in marriage. I wasn't a wife to him. I was a possession. She paused, taking a deep breath. But I'm not a possession anymore, she declared. I'm a woman, and I deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. And I'm not going to be silent anymore. With that, Sarah reached up and untied the ribbon that held her hair back. Her long, dark hair tumbled down around her shoulders, a symbol of her newfound freedom. She looked directly at Father Elijah, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You can't control me anymore," she said. "I'm free." The crowd erupted in applause. They had heard Sarah's story, and they believed her. The spell that Father Elijah had cast over Redemption Gulch was finally broken. The townspeople were ready to hear the rest of Maggie's evidence and decide for themselves if their priest was truly the man he claimed to be. The winds of change were blowing through Redemption Gulch, and nothing would ever be the same again. Father Elijah, seeing his carefully constructed world crumbling around him, finally found his voice. He stepped forward, his face flushed with anger, his eyes blazing with righteous indignation. "This is a lie," he thundered, his voice booming across the square. "This woman is a liar. She's been corrupted by the temptations of the saloon, by the evil influence of that woman, Maggie." He pointed a trembling finger at Maggie, his voice dripping with venom. "She's trying to destroy me, to destroy our church, to destroy everything that is good and decent in this town." He turned to the crowd, his expression pleading. "Don't listen to her. Don't listen to this harlot. She's trying to deceive you, to lead you astray. I am your shepherd, your guide. I have always led you down the path of righteousness." He paused, his voice softening, his eyes filling with tears. "I only wanted to help this woman," he said, gesturing towards Sarah. "Her family was in desperate need. I gave them the money they needed to survive. I saved them from starvation." He spread his arms wide, his voice rising to a crescendo. "I did what any good Christian would do. I acted out of compassion, out of love. And now, she repays me with lies and accusations." He looked around at the crowd, his eyes searching for support. "I am a man of God. I have dedicated my life to serving the Lord and serving you. Don't you believe me? Don't you trust me?" A few of the townsfolk, those who had been loyal to Father Elijah for years, began to murmur their support. Mrs. Abernathy, the church organist, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Old Man Hemlock, the gravedigger, shook his head in disbelief. But the majority of the crowd remained silent, their faces etched with doubt and confusion. Sarah's story had resonated with them. They had seen the sadness in her eyes, the fear in her voice. They knew that she was telling the truth. Father Elijah's attempts to manipulate them with religious rhetoric were falling flat. The spell was broken, and the truth was beginning to dawn. Even those who had once blindly trusted him were now starting to question his motives. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were beginning to sprout. The priest's control over Redemption Gulch was slipping away with every passing moment. Maggie stepped forward, holding up the stack of papers she had gathered. "It's time for the truth," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "I have here documents, letters, and testimonies that prove Father Elijah is not the man he claims to be." She began to read aloud, her voice clear and unwavering. She read the letters from desperate families, detailing Father Elijah's manipulative offers and the thinly veiled threats that ensured their compliance. She presented the financial records, showing the misuse of church funds and the accumulation of wealth in Father Elijah's personal accounts. She even brought forward a traveler who had known Father Elijah in another town. The traveler testified that Father Elijah had been forced to leave that town after similar accusations of misconduct had surfaced. With each piece of evidence, the crowd grew more and more convinced of Father Elijah's guilt. The murmurs of support for him faded away, replaced by gasps of shock and anger. Maggie saved the most damning evidence for last. The letter from Eliza, the young woman who had vanished after pleading for Father Elijah's help. As she read Eliza's words, the crowd fell silent, their hearts heavy with sadness and a growing sense of outrage. "Eliza trusted Father Elijah," Maggie said, her voice trembling with emotion. "She believed that he would help her. But instead, he silenced her forever. She paused, looking directly at Father Elijah, her eyes filled with contempt. "What did you do to her, Father?" she demanded. "Where is she?" Father Elijah remained silent, his face pale and drawn. He knew that he was defeated. The evidence was overwhelming, and the crowd had turned against him. His carefully constructed world had crumbled to dust. The townspeople of Redemption Gulch, finally seeing the truth, began to murmur amongst themselves, anger rising. They had been betrayed by the one man they had trusted most. A few began to advance toward Father Elijah, their faces contorted with rage. It was clear that his time in Redemption Gulch was over. The few remaining loyalists to Father Elijah, seeing the tide turn, stepped forward to defend him, creating a divide in the town. Old Man Hemlock, his voice trembling, pleaded with the crowd. "He baptized my children. He buried my wife. He's a good man, I tell you. He just made a few mistakes." Mrs. Abernathy, weeping openly, echoed his sentiments. "He's always been there for us. He's a pillar of this community. We can't just turn our backs on him now." But their voices were drowned out by the rising tide of anger and betrayal. A burly farmer, his face red with rage, stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Mistakes? He bought and sold women. He stole from the poor. He's a monster." Others joined him, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation. The town square erupted in chaos, with accusations flying back and forth, old grudges resurfacing, and the threat of violence hanging in the air. Maggie, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, stepped forward, raising her hands for silence. "We can't let this turn into a mob," she said, her voice strong and clear. "We need to handle this with justice and reason." But her words were barely heard. The anger had reached a fever pitch, and the townspeople were on the verge of erupting into a full-blown riot. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, silencing the crowd. Everyone turned to see Sheriff Brody standing on the steps of the general store, his pistol raised in the air. "That's enough," he shouted, his voice booming across the square. "I'm putting a stop to this right now. Everyone calm down, or I'll start making arrests." The crowd slowly quieted down, their anger simmering beneath the surface. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his expression stern. "Father Elijah," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. I need to ask you some questions down at the jail." Father Elijah, his face pale and defeated, nodded slowly. He knew that his time was up. He was led away by Sheriff Brody, the crowd parting to make way for them, their eyes filled with a mixture of anger, disappointment, and a sense of profound betrayal. The confrontation had ended, but the fallout in Redemption Gulch was just beginning. The town was deeply divided, and it would take a long time to heal the wounds that Father Elijah had inflicted. The next morning, Father Elijah was brought before a hastily assembled town court. Sheriff Brody presented the evidence, and Maggie testified about her investigation. Even Sarah spoke, her voice now strong and unwavering, reiterating her accusations. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and the unanimous condemnation of the town, Father Elijah finally broke down. He confessed to his crimes, admitting to the misuse of church funds and the exploitation of vulnerable families. He even hinted at what happened to Eliza, though he stopped short of full confession, only saying that she had gone away. The townspeople were stunned. They had never imagined that their beloved priest could be capable of such wickedness. The sense of betrayal was palpable. The court quickly reached a verdict. Father Elijah was stripped of his position as priest and banished from Redemption Gulch. He was given 24 hours to pack his belongings and leave, never to return. As he was being escorted out of town, Father Elijah turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of remorse and resentment. "I did it all for you," he said, his voice barely audible. "I wanted to give you a better life." Sarah looked at him with pity, but also with a sense of closure. "You didn't do it for me," she said. "You did it for yourself. You wanted to control me, to possess me, but I'm not yours anymore." Father Elijah was led away, his head bowed in shame. As he disappeared over the horizon, a collective sigh of relief swept through Redemption Gulch. The darkness that had hung over the town for so long had finally lifted. The town now faced the difficult task of rebuilding their community and restoring their faith. The church, once a symbol of unity and hope, was now a reminder of betrayal and deceit. It would take time, but the people of Redemption Gulch were determined to heal and to move forward. They had learned a valuable lesson about the importance of questioning authority and the dangers of blind faith. And they were ready to embrace a new beginning, a future where truth and justice would prevail. But what would become of Sarah? And would the town ever truly trust again? Only time would tell. Sarah stood in the center of Redemption Gulch, watching as Father Elijah disappeared over the horizon. A wave of relief washed over her, but also a sense of uncertainty. She was free, but she was also alone. Maggie approached her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What are you going to do now, Sarah?" she asked gently. Sarah looked around at the town, at the faces of the people who had once revered Father Elijah and who had now rallied around her. She felt a sense of connection to them, a bond forged in shared pain and shared hope. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I could go back home to my family. They need the money that Father Elijah gave them." Maggie shook her head. "That money is tainted, Sarah. It was earned through deceit and exploitation. You can't go back there." She paused, her eyes twinkling. "Besides, you have a home here now if you want it. You've shown this town what it means to be brave and to stand up for what's right. We need you, Sarah." Other townsfolk approached, offering words of support and encouragement. They invited her to stay, to become a part of their community. They promised to help her build a new life, a life of her own choosing. Sarah listened, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had never felt so accepted, so valued. She realized that Redemption Gulch, despite its flaws and its secrets, was a place where she could finally find peace and belonging. But there was another option. Maggie had quietly been working to recover some of the funds Father Elijah had stolen, and she'd succeeded in getting a good portion of it back. Enough for Sarah to start over anywhere she chose. Enough, perhaps, to help her family without Sarah having to return to them. Sarah thought of her family, struggling to survive in their drought-stricken town. She knew that they needed her help, but she also knew that she couldn't go back to the life she had left behind. She had changed too much. She thought of Eliza, the young woman who had disappeared after seeking Father Elijah's help. She felt a responsibility to find out what had happened to her, to bring her justice. Finally, she made her decision. She would stay in Redemption Gulch, at least for now. She would use the money that Maggie had recovered to help her family, and she would dedicate herself to finding out what had happened to Eliza. She would build a new life for herself, a life of purpose and meaning. And she would never again be a victim. She would be a survivor. With Father Elijah gone, Redemption Gulch began the slow process of healing. The church, once a symbol of division, was reopened under the guidance of a new, younger priest, a man who preached forgiveness and compassion rather than fire and brimstone. He encouraged open communication and transparency, vowing to never repeat the mistakes of his predecessor. The townspeople, chastened by their experience, learned to be more critical of authority and more supportive of one another. They started a community fund to help families in need, ensuring that no one would ever again be forced to make the desperate choices that Sarah's family had faced. Maggie, hailed as a hero, continued to run the Golden Nugget, providing a safe haven for anyone who needed a listening ear or a strong drink. She became a respected figure in the community, a symbol of courage and integrity. Sarah, true to her word, began her investigation into the disappearance of Eliza. She spent hours poring over old records, interviewing travelers, and following up on any leads she could find. The townspeople, impressed by her determination, offered their help, sharing information and resources. The search for Eliza proved long and difficult. Many believed that she was long gone, but Sarah refused to give up hope. She felt a deep connection to Eliza, a sense of shared pain and a burning desire for justice. Months turned into years, but Sarah never stopped searching. And then, one day, she received a letter. It was from a small town several hundred miles away. A woman matching Eliza's description had been seen working as a seamstress. Sarah immediately set out, her heart pounding with excitement and trepidation. She arrived in the town and, after a few inquiries, found the seamstress. It was Eliza. Eliza was alive, but she was traumatized and broken. She had been held captive by Father Elijah for months, subjected to abuse and manipulation. She had finally managed to escape, but she was afraid to return to her family, fearing that she would bring shame upon them. Sarah listened to Eliza's story, her heart filled with sorrow and anger. She promised Eliza that she would help her heal and that she would bring Father Elijah to justice. Together, Sarah and Eliza returned to Redemption Gulch, where they were greeted as heroes. Eliza testified against Father Elijah, providing the final piece of evidence needed to convict him of his crimes. Father Elijah was eventually apprehended and brought to justice, finally paying the price for his wickedness. And Redemption Gulch, after a long and difficult journey, had finally found peace and redemption. The town had learned a hard lesson, but they had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. The future looked brighter than it had in a long time. Eliza, with Sarah's support, slowly began to heal from her trauma. She found solace in the community of Redemption Gulch, surrounded by people who understood her pain and offered her unwavering support. She started a small sewing business, using her skills to create beautiful clothes for the townspeople. She found a sense of purpose and belonging, something she had never experienced before. Sarah, having brought Eliza to justice, finally felt a sense of peace. She continued to live in Redemption Gulch, becoming a pillar of the community, a symbol of courage, resilience, and hope. She never forgot the lessons she had learned, and she dedicated her life to helping others in need. Maggie, her reputation solidified as the town's moral compass, continued to run the Golden Nugget with a firm but fair hand. She used her influence to advocate for the less fortunate, ensuring that everyone in Redemption Gulch had a chance to succeed. Redemption Gulch, once a town shrouded in secrets and darkness, had finally emerged into the light. The people had learned a valuable lesson about the importance of questioning. The story of Father Elijah and Sarah would be told for generations to come, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, redemption is always possible. The end.